Are you thinking about purchasing a home through a rent-to-own agreement? If so, you should think again. Rent-to-own purchases are almost always a scam, and they come with a lot of hidden risk. It's important to be aware of the potential dangers before you make any kind of commitment. In this video, we'll look at the risks associated with the rent-to-own purchases and explain why they're almost always a bad idea. Before we jump into all the associated risks with rent-to-own purchases, it's important to understand how this type of arrangement is supposed to work. Basically, a rent-to-own agreement is an arrangement where the tenant leases a property for a set period of time with a preset agreement to purchase the home at the end of the lease period. This is seen as an attractive option for home buyers who may not have the money saved up to make a traditional down payment or who don't have perfect credit. The main idea behind rent-to-own is that by the end of the lease agreement, the tenant will purchase the property. The way these lease agreements are marketed is that a portion of the monthly rent will be applied to the purchase price once the purchase is set to take place. In other words, it's a way for a home buyer to build up a down payment towards a property while renting it at the same time. This seems like a win-win for both the tenant and the landlord because the tenant eventually purchases the home and becomes a homeowner, and the landlord eventually sells the property after collecting rent for a period of time. However, there are many hidden risks and costs associated with the rent-to-own agreements that prospective home buyers should be aware of. Rent-to-own agreements can often be predatory and take advantage of unsuspecting homebuyers who may be desperate for a place to live. This is why it's important for potential homebuyers to fully understand what they're getting into before signing any sort of rental or purchase agreement. First and foremost, you need to make sure the person you're buying the house from actually owns the house. This may seem obvious, but since these agreements are usually done directly between the tenant and the landlord, there are no third parties like a real estate agent or a title company looking over the paperwork or the process to make sure everything is being done above board. Because of the lack of oversight, there is a lot of fraud around the marketing of these types of sales, just like there is with online rental ads. It's very easy for scammers to pretend to be the landlord or owner of a property, even if they have nothing to do with it. They do this to either collect deposits or critical personal information like social security numbers from unsuspecting tenants. Never, and I mean never, send personal information or money to a landlord or homeowner before you have physically been inside the house. If someone tells you they lost the key or they're out of town at the moment and you need to send them the deposit or information before you can tour the home, run away as fast as you can because you are almost certainly about to be scammed out of your money. These are classic signs that you are dealing with someone who is not the actual owner of the property. Now that's out of the way, and assuming you're in contact with the true owner of the home, let's focus on how the actual rent-to-own agreement itself is most likely a scam. As part of the rent-to-own agreement, the landlord will prepare either a lease option or lease purchase agreement for the tenant to sign that will outline both the rental and purchase terms. This will include important information such as when the tenant has to complete the purchase, what the purchase price for the home will be, and what the monthly payments are and how they're broken down. I cannot stress enough that you should always 100% of the time have a real estate attorney review this agreement if you're set on the rent-to-own process. Spending a few $100s having an attorney review this document up front could save you thousands of dollars and headaches further down the road. The details laid out in this agreement are where things start to get fishy fast. First is the monthly payment and how it's structured. The biggest lure of a rent-to-own process is that a portion of your payment will be set aside every month so that when you're ready to purchase the home, you will have a down payment waiting to be applied to the purchase. In theory, that sounds great. But in practice, these agreements almost always have a clause in them that states that if you as the tenant decide not to purchase the home for any reason, you forfeit that money to the landlord. This becomes a de facto way for the landlord to make additional income from their tenants, since a vast majority of rent-to-own tenants ultimately decide not to purchase the home they're renting. Also, as it relates to monthly payments, landlords very often charge much higher market rents for these homes because of the allure of the option of purchase. So for instance, you might be able to rent a similar home for $2,000 a month, but because of the rent-to-own option, you agree to pay $2,400 a month, with $200 a month supposedly going towards your eventual down payment, and the other $200 just being a premium the landlord is charging because of the rent-to-own option. At the end of the first year, if you decide not to purchase the home, this means you paid nearly $5,000 more than you normally would have to rent a similar home. In addition to the issues with the monthly payment, these types of agreements often require large non-refundable deposits that can leave little room for negotiation. This can be extremely risky for homebuyers that don't have a surplus of cash laying around. By entering into a rent-to-own agreement, you are bypassing most of the consumer protections that are built into the normal home buying process. For instance, if you were purchasing a home through the traditional process, you would almost certainly have a home inspection completed, detailing any potential issues with the home before you finalize the purchase. However, with rent-to-own situations, since you're initially just renting the home, you would likely forego the home inspection and sign your agreement without having that information. That could really end up biting you in the end because you're likely to uncover issues while you're renting the home, and you'll ultimately have to decide if you still want to buy the house when the lease option portion ends. And if you decide you found too many concerning issues while living in the home to move forward with the purchase, you'll lose out on all the extra rent you've paid and any non-refundable deposits. Additionally, rent-to-own agreements can include a lot of fine print that can leave you on the hook for extra fees and payments. Many people find that their rent-to-own agreement contains all sorts of additional costs and expenses that they weren't expecting when they signed on the dotted line. Again, this is another reason it's imperative you have an attorney read over your agreement before you sign it. The biggest risk in this type of agreement is that you may end up paying much more than the market value for the home. The landlord usually sets the purchase price for the home in the initial lease option agreement, and this is done without a real estate agent or appraiser weighing in on what a fair price for the home should be. If this is the case, either one of two things will happen when the lease portion ends. The first is you can't move forward with the purchase because the appraisal for the property is too low and you won't be able to obtain financing from a lender. And again, if you can't move forward with the purchase at that time, you would forfeit any non-refundable deposits and all the extra rent you had been paying through no fault of your own. Or secondly, you may move forward with the purchase by making up the difference between what the bank thinks the home is worth versus what you agreed to pay for the home. So if you initially agree to buy the home for $400,000, but it only appraises or is worth $380,000, you would be on the hook to come up with another $20,000, which is a long-winded way of saying you're overpaying for the house. Most of the time, this will be because the landlord is greedy and is purposefully overpricing the house so they can sell it for more than it's worth. But there could also be additional reasons the price you agreed to is an overpayment for the home. For instance, if you make your rent-to-own agreement during the seller's market when houses are selling for a premium, but then there's a downturn in the housing market when your option to purchase comes due and house prices have since come down, you're stuck paying the seller's market price that you originally agreed to. Finally, there are very few protections for homebuyers who enter into a rent-to-own agreement. If something goes wrong with the agreement, or if the landlord fails to live up to their end of the deal, it can be difficult to get out of the agreement without being subject to hefty fines or penalties. There are lots of little devils in the details as well. For instance, most of these agreements have clauses that say if you miss a rental payment, the purchase option is terminated and you forfeit the money you've been saving up. In my opinion, this is actually predatory, since most buyers looking at this option are doing so because they had previous credit issues. And basically what the landlord is doing here is they're adding a clause for a buyer that has credit issues and a history of missing payments that says if you miss a payment, the purchase part of the agreement is terminated. That's just wrong. Think of it this way. What's the actual benefit for a landlord to offer this type of agreement unless they're taking advantage of the tenant in some way? It's a lot of additional work and uncertainty for the landlord to sell the house with this kind of agreement. So if they aren't overcharging or there isn't some scheme involved, why would they do it? Otherwise, they would just sell the house for sale normally and sell it right away without the hassle of having to collect rent from a tenant who may or may not eventually buy the property. For these reasons, it is almost always a bad idea for homebuyers to enter into a rent-to-own agreement. There are far better alternatives that can provide similar benefits without the risk and additional costs associated with rent-to-own purchases. You are much better off saving your money and building equity in a traditional home purchase. Typically, people enter into these agreements because they think it's their only available option to purchase a home. This could be due to limited or no down payment available or because of issues with credit. Just know there are resources available to help you execute a home buying plan that are much less risky. A good lender will work with you to build your credit the right way without charging any fees for that assistance. And you're much better off renting a home at a normal rental price and putting the extra money you would have been paying for a rent-to-own sale on the side for yourself. This way, when you've saved up your down payment and you've gotten your credit where it needs to be to buy a home, you can choose from any home you'd like at a reasonable price and with protections in place instead of having to move forward with overpaying for the home you were renting. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the rent-to-own process and why it's almost always a terrible idea. If you'd like to get updates on future educational real estate videos, be sure to click like and turn on notifications so you can hear about new content as soon as we post it. And if you've been discouraged about the home buying process and you've been considering a rent-to-own purchase, please drop me a line and I'll be happy to get you in touch with some local real estate professionals who can help you achieve your home buying goals in a much less risky and more responsible way.